Tonight we begin with something quietly unsettling but gently meandering. Mental health in the Middle Ages, a topic rarely discussed at feasts, seldom whispered in cathedrals, and almost never written about in scented ink. But here in our peaceful plodding tale, we'll open the creaky wooden door to one particularly average medieval life and take a slow, soft-footed stroll through 20 connected episodes of psychological confusion, spiritual speculation, and medicinal misadventure. So, as always, dim the lights, loosen your laces, and allow your modern worries to drift quietly into the night like mist over an English fen. For now, you are in the past, a sleepy past with no air conditioning, no social media, and an almost dangerous over-reliance on turnips. Our story begins in the year 1384 in a modest village located somewhere too unimportant to appear on any map, which is fortunate because this gives us more room to imagine the goats. In a house made of wattle, daub, and mild despair lives a man named Aldrich. Not Sir Aldrich, not Aldrich the Wise, just Aldrich. His title, should anyone ask, is that fellow who cries near the grain sacks sometimes. At 37 years old, a respectable age for someone who hasn't yet been trampled by livestock or sentenced for theft, Aldrich wakes with the same burden each day, a sense of vague, unspecified sadness. He doesn't call it depression. That word doesn't exist for him. Instead, his affliction is called melancholia, a term that sounds much more poetic and somehow less threatening, especially when muttered by the village herbalist with moss in her teeth. On this particular morning, Aldrich awakens not with a scream or a dramatic gasp, but with the slow, reluctant exhale of a man who has dreamed of warm bread and woken up to his own elbow in a puddle. The roof leaks. The blanket smells faintly of cabbage and disappointment. His straw mattress has flattened into something more philosophical than comfortable. He sits up. The room tilts. It always does that. It might be the humors. He isn't sure. No one is. The four humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, are the cornerstones of medieval medicine. At any given time, someone nearby is either purging one, vomiting another, or suggesting leeches as a treatment for the rest. Aldrich, unfortunately, is believed to suffer from an excess of black bile, which apparently causes sadness, lethargy, and an irresistible urge to stare at walls. Aldrich stares at walls. His wife, Matilda, does not understand. She's a practical woman who enjoys turnip soup and arguing with the baker. She often tells Aldrich to go outside and touch moss, which is the 14th century equivalent of getting some fresh air. It doesn't help, but he tries, mostly to avoid another long lecture about how her cousin Cedric once got sad and simply shook it off by eating garlic and yelling into a well. After breakfast, barley porridge with a decorative rat, the village bell tolls, reminding Aldrich that he is expected to help mend the communal fence. He does not want to. His body feels heavy, like it's been filled with wet wool and low expectations. But to refuse is to invite suspicion, and suspicion in a medieval village leads to unhelpful rumors about the devil. He stumbles outside. The morning is damp. The sky is the color of boiled linen. A goat bleats at him, possibly in judgment. He finds the fence, which is less a structure and more a loose suggestion of boundaries, and begins to hammer pegs with all the enthusiasm of a damp sponge. He thinks about nothing, or possibly everything. It's hard to tell. Around midday, Aldrich experiences what he has come to call the heaviness. It settles over him like a winter cloak. His arms ache. His mind slows. He imagines lying in a quiet stream and letting the current take him somewhere where black bile is less of a concern. This is observed by Brother Egbert, the local friar, who interprets Aldrich's slowness not as sadness, but as a sign of spiritual imbalance. Brother Egbert believes many things are caused by spiritual imbalance, including indigestion, clumsy oxen, and socks that vanish from the wash. "You seem afflicted," the friar says. Aldrich, unsure of how to respond, nods solemnly. He does not mention the dreams or the fog in his brain or the time he saw a rabbit and cried. He merely says, "It is the bile again." "Ah," says Brother Egbert, who nods with the certainty of a man who once read half a book. "Then you must fast. Pray. Perhaps flagellate, if time allows." Aldrich promises to do one of those things and then walks away slowly, just fast enough to avoid further suggestions. By evening, the sadness becomes sharp. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just sharper than before, like a spoon that's been filed down to a quiet point. He retreats to the field behind the chapel, where no one goes except bees and people avoiding chores. There, under a tree that might be an elm or might be a deeply committed shrub, Aldrich lies on his back and stares at the sky. He wonders if this feeling will ever leave. He wonders if he is broken or merely misaligned. From the distance, the voice of Matilda drifts across the hills, calling him home for stew. He closes his eyes, sighs a little too loudly, and begins the slow walk back. There are still 19 parts to go, and very few of them will involve resolutions. Some may include herbs. Most will involve poor advice and questionable beverages. For now, rest your head, breathe deeply, and know that even in the distant past there were those who felt too much and said too little, and some of them made it to bedtime anyway. Sleep well. The morning after Aldrich's contemplative episode beneath the possibly elm tree arrived with the same unremarkable dampness as the day before. The air smelled of soil, soot, and something faintly fishy, which was troubling because the village was landlocked. Aldrich awoke not with a start, but with a vague awareness that life was happening again, and he was expected to participate. Matilda had already risen, presumably to shout at someone about bread or soap, and he was left alone in their modest, lopsided hut with its sagging beams and ceiling that hosted an enthusiastic spider colony. His body ached in its usual places, knees, shoulders, the general soul region, and as he sat up, the familiar sensation of melancholia wrapped around him like a woolen shawl that never quite dried. There was no language for it in the village. Only that Aldrich wasn't right in the head or had too much bile, depending on whether the speaker favored theology or folk medicine. Today, it would be medicine. Sort of. Before the sun had fully risen, he was sent somewhat lovingly, somewhat forcefully, by Matilda to the edge of the woods where old Marit, the local herbalist, resided in a hut made of moss and stern glances. Marit was approximately 90 years old, or as villagers put it, aged beyond math. Her hut smelled like boiled roots and damp shoes. She welcomed Aldrich with a grunt and instructed him to sit on a stool that was 3 legs worth of confidence. Without pleasantries, she poked him in the ribs, sniffed the side of his head, and declared that he was bile-heavy, spirit-sagged, and sleep-thinned. Aldrich nodded. She rummaged through a series of cloth sacks, wooden bowls, and suspicious jars until she assembled what she called a remedy. It involved crushed sage, dried chamomile, and a small, angry-looking beetle she insisted was necessary for balance. She brewed these with a spoon made from what might have been a former spoon and handed him a cup of steaming, vaguely green liquid. It tasted like boiled regret. Aldrich drank it anyway. 3 times daily, she said. Or once, if you value your taste buds. She handed him a cloth pouch of dried herbs and a waxy square labeled with a drawing of a cloud frowning at the sun. Rub this on your temples when your thoughts start marching, she added. He thanked her in the way one thanks a thunderstorm for passing and shuffled back to the village with his pockets full of plant crumbs and uncertain hope. By midday, the herbs had done little besides make him mildly itchy. Aldrich sat on a low bench near the communal well, staring at nothing in particular. The world moved around him in small, purposeful circles. Children threw sticks at each other. A dog chased its own tail with professional commitment. Someone argued with the baker about whether yesterday's bread was technically edible or a weapon. Aldrich watched it all from beneath the warm fog of his own mind. Brother Egbert approached as he often did, with his sandals dusty and his voice too cheerful for someone who lived on boiled barley. Brother Egbert folded his arms and lowered his voice to what he imagined was a sacred whisper. "There is a shrine," he began, "to St. Eustace the Muddled, south of here, beyond the river. Pilgrims go when the mind grows heavy." Aldrich blinked. A pilgrimage? He had not walked farther than the turnip field in over 3 years. His boots were more theoretical than practical. But Egbert continued, explaining that St. Eustace had once confused a goat for a vision of the divine and was now venerated by those who wandered in thought and spirit. "The walk is good for you," Egbert said. "It clears the bile, sweats the sadness from your pores." Aldrich doubted this. He suspected it simply exhausted people into silence. Still, Matilda agreed with the friar, which meant Aldrich would walk. And so the next morning he found himself equipped with a crust of bread, a pouch of Maritz herbs, and a wooden token bearing the likeness of a man squinting at the sky, supposedly St. Eustace. The token was meant to protect him from misfortune. It did not, however, protect him from blisters. The path to the shrine was unremarkable, uneven, muddy, lined with hedges that occasionally hissed with invisible wildlife. Aldrich walked slowly, as one does when trying to outrun one's own thoughts, which was ineffective but at least distracting. Birds chirped in tones that felt slightly sarcastic. A squirrel dropped something suspiciously soft from a branch above. At midday, he sat beside a crooked stream and ate the crust, which had absorbed enough humidity to double as both food and sponge. He washed it down with a sip of whatever tea remained in his flask, now the temperature of regret. Around him, the trees rustled with the kind of indifference only nature can muster. He breathed deeply. He felt not better, but not worse. Just there. A man between destinations, both physical and otherwise. That evening he reached a roadside inn that appeared to have been built entirely out of leftover barn pieces and confidence. The innkeeper was a cheerful woman with one eye and a laugh that could startle foxes. She offered a bed of straw and a bowl of something that might once have been soup. He accepted both. That night, Aldrich lay beneath a ceiling of creaking timbers, staring up through the spaces between them at a sky only just visible. He wondered if St. Eustace had ever truly seen that divine goat, or if he had simply needed to. He wondered if sadness had saints, if thinking too much was a kind of prayer. He slept poorly. The mattress was straw. The pillow was a folded tunic. Someone snored through the wall like a remorseful cow. Still he dreamed. He could not remember the dream, only that it involved water and the smell of thyme. And when he woke, there was still the ache, still the fog, but also the distant clang of a bell calling him further south, toward a shrine, and perhaps some kind of answer that wouldn't come in a bottle, or a brew, or a beetle. The following morning began as most medieval mornings did, with a rooster that seemed personally offended by the concept of sleep. Aldrich sat up slowly, joints protesting with the same enthusiasm as a rusted hinge, and brushed a handful of straw from his shoulder. The innkeeper's dog was asleep on his boot. He wasn't sure if that was good luck or an omen, so he simply waited until the dog decided to move of its own accord, which took approximately the length of a minor feast day. With a nod of thanks to the one-eyed innkeeper and the last of his tea sloshing about in a leather flask, Aldrich resumed his reluctant pilgrimage toward the shrine of St. Eustace the Muddled. The air smelled of wet leaves and something faintly medicinal, possibly the innkeeper's stew or her alarming collection of herbs nailed to the walls. The road south wound through low hills dotted with sheep that gazed at him with the quiet judgment of creatures who understood their place in the world and were unimpressed by his. As he walked, Aldrich attempted to recall the dream from the night before, but it faded like breath on a mirror. There had been water, maybe, a current, a sensation of floating or drowning or both, and time. Definitely time. Not the concept, but the herb. This felt important in the way that forgotten things often do. By mid-morning, he passed a roadside shrine too small to be sacred and too crooked to be architectural. It consisted of a wooden post with a carving of a man's face, eyes wide, mouth slightly agape, like someone who had just realized he left the oven on. This, according to a weathered plaque in Latin he could not read, was Saint Eustace, gazing eternally at the heavens or perhaps just trying to identify a passing bird. A small bowl at the base of the shrine held coins, pebbles, and what might have been a potato in its final days. Aldrich added a smooth stone from his pocket, unsure if this was appropriate but feeling the need to participate in some way. The air around the shrine was quiet, as if even the wind paused to reflect. He sat beside it for a moment, not praying exactly, but not praying either. His thoughts wandered in that peculiar medieval way, drifting from soup to mortality to the mystery of why goats always look like they know something. He rose eventually and continued walking, feet sore, mind gently unraveling like poorly spun wool. It was late afternoon when the path dipped into a hollow where the real shrine was said to reside. Aldrich arrived to find not a grand structure, but a modest stone chapel flanked by crooked trees and a goose. The goose was perched on the steps like a sentry, eyeing him with the suspicion usually reserved for tax collectors and particularly clumsy jugglers. He approached cautiously. The goose did not move. This, he decided, must be part of the test. He bowed slightly, unsure whether to the goose or to St. Eustace, and stepped around it with the delicacy of a man who knew how fast poultry could escalate a situation. The door to the shrine creaked in the way that all old wooden doors do, long, theatrical, and slightly damp. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wax, dry herbs, and something unidentifiable but possibly hopeful. A single candle flickered in a niche beside a weather-worn statue of the saint himself, depicted not with a sword or a cross, but with one hand raised uncertainly, palm out, as if greeting or halting or simply unsure. A carved goat stood loyally at his side, expression unreadable. Aldrich sat on a worn bench, the kind designed more for humility than comfort, and let the silence settle around him. There was no one else present. No priest, no guide, no stern nun dusting things. Just him, St. Eustace, and possibly the goose, who might have followed him inside but was being discreet about it. He closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words came out tangled and soft, like thread pulled from a tunic long past mending. He asked for clarity, though he wasn't sure what he meant by that. He asked for peace, though he couldn't define it. Mostly he asked for the heaviness in his chest to lift, or at least shift slightly to the left so he could breathe more easily. There was no reply, divine or otherwise, just the quiet pop of the candle and the faint honk from outside that suggested the goose had opinions. He stayed there until the shadows lengthened and the corners of the shrine grew dim. Then, with the same slow sigh he used each morning upon waking, he stood. On a shelf near the exit sat a small wooden box labeled alms. He had no coin, only a crust of dry bread and a half-used packet of Marit's questionable balm. Feeling both practical and penitent, he placed the balm in the box, hoping St. Eustace appreciated remedies with a shelf life of uncertain intentions. Outside, the goose was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it made his ears buzz. He started down the path again, not homeward, but toward the next village, which he vaguely recalled had a tavern with a roof and chairs that didn't wobble unless insulted. The sky overhead was turning the color of old pewter, and a breeze picked up that carried the scent of something vaguely sweet and entirely unplaceable. He walked without urgency, thoughts rolling gently like distant thunder, not entirely sure what the shrine had done for him, if anything, but aware that something in him had shifted, even if only from one uncomfortable position to another. Ahead, the road curved, and somewhere beyond the next bend there would be soup or a bed or perhaps just another goose with a firm opinion on theology. The road into the village of Greyweather was marked by a lopsided wooden sign dangling from a post that leaned dramatically to the left, as if it too were unsure about its life choices. The sign bore a faint carving of a duck, or perhaps a very fat quill, and the words "Welcome" possibly scratched beneath in faded letters. Aldrich trudged beneath it, boots trailing streaks of dried mud and thought crumbs, his legs moving mostly from memory. The sky above hung low and moody, casting a gray tint over everything, including his own mood, which had now shifted from melancholia to a kind of heavy philosophical shrug. He had not spoken to another person since the innkeeper with one eye, unless one counted the goose, which he was beginning to do. Greyweather was a place that looked exactly like it sounded, stone cottages hunched together like gossiping grandmothers, chimneys issuing reluctant puffs of smoke, and roads that were more puddle than path. A dog barked half-heartedly from a doorway. A child stared at Aldrich as if trying to decide whether he was a pilgrim, a taxman, or just another adult who had lost a debate with destiny. He offered the child a slow nod of peace. The child responded by producing a turnip from somewhere and biting into it with the steely resolve of someone raised on boiled things. The tavern stood near the center of the village, bearing the dubious name, the Mild Comfort. Its door was slightly ajar, not as an invitation, but more as a statement that it had given up on latching properly. Aldrich stepped inside and was greeted by the scent of wet wood, smoke, and a stew that had clearly been cooking since the last Saint's Day, possibly longer. A handful of locals sat around tables, all of them possessed by the same look of quiet familiarity with disappointment. The barkeep was a thin man with a beard that seemed reluctant to grow uniformly and a gaze that suggested he had long ago decided nothing was ever truly surprising again. Aldrich approached the counter with the solemnity of a man requesting both food and minimal conversation. "Stew," he said, "and something to drink that doesn't ask questions." The barkeep grunted once and produced both, a bowl of something brown with occasional chunks and a mug of liquid that tasted of barley and thyme. Aldrich found a seat near the hearth, which emitted more smoke than heat, and began to eat with the careful focus of someone who did not wish to offend the stew by examining it too closely. As he ate, his thoughts drifted back to the shrine. St. Eustace, with his open hand and confused expression, had not offered clarity, but he had offered a place to sit, and that was something. Perhaps the saint's gift was not answers, but furniture. Perhaps sanctity and seating were more connected than theologians admitted. The tavern's warmth, or what passed for it, began to soften his edges. He didn't feel well, exactly, but he felt present, which for Aldrich was an improvement. He sipped the drink and stared into the hearth, imagining the logs had opinions. A man sat across from him without asking, which was not unusual in a tavern where boundaries were more theoretical than enforced. The man was broad-shouldered, wearing a cloak that looked like it had once been important. He had the air of someone who had fought in a war and now specialized in watching soup simmer. "You got the look," the man said, not unkindly. Aldrich raised an eyebrow. "Of someone who's either returning from a pilgrimage or escaping one." Aldrich thought for a moment. "Possibly both." The man nodded as if that were an entirely valid answer. "They say St. Eustace saw God in a goat." Or was it a goat, God? Depends who's telling it. Eldrick considered this. I think the goat was mostly uninvolved. The man grinned, revealing a few teeth that had clearly gone on their own journeys. Conversation flickered, then faded into silence, as conversations often did in gray weather where people spoke only when they had run out of ways to avoid it. The room darkened slightly as evening pressed its forehead against the windows. A woman entered the tavern, wrapped in shawls and purpose, and sat at the far end of the room. She was followed by a cat that clearly belonged to no one and everything simultaneously. Aldrich watched the cat more than the woman. The cat did not seem burdened by humors or melancholy. The cat simply existed, as cats do, with the confidence of a minor deity. He envied that. The stew gone, the mug empty, Aldrich sat still for some time, letting the noises of the tavern wash over him like a lukewarm bath. There was comfort in the ordinariness of it all, the scrape of spoons, the mumble of low conversation, the size of furniture adjusting to centuries of use. He began to feel not better, but less worse. Eventually, he rented a room upstairs, which turned out to be more of a shelf with a blanket, but it had a door that shut and a window that looked out onto a roof occupied by 3 argumentative pigeons. He lay on the bed, arms folded over his chest like someone expecting to be painted. The moon cast a weak light across the ceiling beams, revealing the occasional spider going about its night with more direction than Aldrich had felt in years. He thought about home, which seemed impossibly far. He thought about Matilda, who likely assumed he'd wandered into a ditch or a philosophical crisis. He thought about Brother Egbert, whose advice was terrible but well-meaning. He thought about the bomb he'd left behind, the one with the frowning cloud. He wondered if saints kept lost things. He wondered if it mattered. The sounds of the tavern below softened, turned to muffled thumps and creaks. Somewhere, someone laughed, low and brief, the kind of laugh that sounded like it had been borrowed for a moment. Aldrich didn't sleep, not really, but he did close his eyes, and for a time the thoughts in his head moved slowly enough that he could almost walk among them. The morning in Greyweather arrived not with birdsong or bells, but with the slow, persistent drip of water from the eaves directly onto the corner of Aldrich's room, forming a growing puddle that had ambitions of becoming a moat. He opened his eyes to the soft groan of timbers adjusting themselves and the faint echo of someone downstairs scolding a cat in a language composed primarily of sighs. He hadn't so much slept as hovered, drifting in and out of wakefulness with the consistency of damp linen. His back ached in 3 new places, 2 of which might not have existed yesterday. He sat up slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if attempting to massage his thoughts into something manageable. The window offered a view of mist and pigeon feathers. One of the pigeons was missing, perhaps having resolved its argument by leaving the roof in favor of a less confrontational ledge. Downstairs, the tavern had already resumed its quiet routine. The barkeep polished mugs that would never shine, and the stew pot exhaled the same weary aroma of boiled sameness. Aldrich took a seat near the window, which let in light filtered through mist and regret, and ordered a bowl of whatever the stew was pretending to be today. It arrived quickly, lumpy and beige, accompanied by a crust of bread that could have qualified as defensive architecture. As he ate, the man from the night before, the one with the war-weathered cloak and relaxed shoulders, returned, settling into the seat opposite as though he had never left. "You're still here," the man observed, with a tone that made it unclear if this was a compliment or an accusation. Aldrich chewed, nodded once, then responded, "The road seemed unsure whether it wanted me." The man grunted in approval, as if he too had once been rejected by a road. They sat in silence, the kind that was neither awkward nor meaningful, just present. The tavern murmured around them. A woman near the hearth mended a sock with the intensity of someone performing surgery. A chicken wandered briefly through the front door, looked around, and left. After some time, the man, whose name, it turned out, was Jaren, spoke again. "If your mind's still fogged, you might try the apothecary. He's half blind, but listens well, which is rarer than you'd think." Aldrich, with no clear plans and a vague yearning for any new direction, agreed. Jaren pointed the way, second lane to the left, past the well that never worked beside the house with ivy that only grew sideways. "If you see red door that smells like moldy thyme, you've gone too far," he added. Aldrich finished the stew, if it could be said to have a finish, and set out. The streets of Greyweather were quieter than most villages, not because the people were unfriendly, but because they had simply learned to keep their thoughts inside where they wouldn't get rained on. Aldrich passed a man arguing with a barrel and a woman yelling at a loaf of bread. Both seemed perfectly content afterward. The apothecary's shop was indeed beside the sideways ivy, and its sign, a faded painting of a mortar and pestle, swayed on rusted hinges, creaking rhythmically as if sighing in time with the town. The door opened with resistance, as if the shop itself was hesitant to admit another wandering soul. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs, ink, and something faintly resembling boiled leather. Shelves lined the walls, burdened with jars, scrolls, and the occasional object that defied identification. The lighting was minimal, relying on whatever filtered through two high, dirty windows and a series of candles that had melted into comically abstract shapes. Behind the counter sat a man whose beard was long enough to be mistaken for a scarf. His eyes, milky and alert, turned toward Aldrich with the focus of someone who had trained their other senses to do the heavy lifting. "Welcome," the man said, voice gravelly but kind. "Do you seek relief, understanding, or just somewhere that doesn't serve stew?" Aldrich, caught slightly off guard, replied, "Mostly silence that listens back." The apothecary chuckled softly, a sound like parchment folding. "And then you are in the right place, though I offer no cures, only considerations." He gestured to a stool shaped like a question mark and invited Aldrich to sit. For the next hour, Aldrich spoke more than he had in days. He described the heaviness, the fog, the way thoughts sometimes moved like molasses uphill. He mentioned the shrine, the goat, the bomb, and the stew, though not necessarily in that order. The apothecary nodded gently through it all, occasionally rummaging through a drawer or adjusting a candle that didn't need adjusting. When Aldrich had finished, the apothecary stood, retrieved a small cloth pouch from a high shelf, and placed it on the counter. "These are dried mullein leaves and bits of yarrow. Steep them when the world gets too sharp. They won't fix the mind, but they might give it a softer place to rest." Aldrich accepted the pouch with the solemnity of a man receiving a letter from an old friend. "And this," the apothecary added, producing a slip of paper covered in tight, spidery script, "is a list of questions, not to be answered, just to be asked. Sometimes the asking is enough." Aldrich tucked both into a satchel, thanked the man, and stepped back into the mist, which had thickened into something resembling philosophy. As he made his way back toward the tavern, the village seemed quieter still, as if it too were considering questions it didn't intend to answer. He passed the broken well, now covered in moss, and the sideways ivy, which seemed to have grown half an inch. A black cat watched him from a windowsill with the disinterested gaze of one who knew the entire plot already. Back at the mild comfort, Jaren was gone, but his empty mug remained, a small totem of temporary connections. Aldrich sat by the window again, watching the pigeons return to their roof. The third one was back, now joined by a fourth. Their disagreements resumed immediately. He pulled the slip of paper from his satchel and unfolded it, letting his eyes scan the first few lines. The questions were simple, even childlike. "What color is your silence? When did you last speak to your shadow? Does your sadness wear shoes?" He smiled faintly. The questions didn't help exactly, but they didn't hurt either. and sometimes in gray weather that was all one could ask. The sixth day of Aldrich's wandering journey dawned with an uncomfortable clarity, the kind brought on not by divine revelation or herbal infusion, but by a sudden and urgent awareness of personal odor. He awoke to the distinct sensation that his tunic had developed its own personality overnight, one that favored mildew, sour stew, and the earthy undertone of tavern smoke. The bed, such as it was, had conspired with his joints to provide all the restorative comfort of a moderately aggressive bench, and his blankets smelled faintly of onions despite no known contact with them. It had not rained, precisely, but the air was saturated with the kind of dampness that made everything feel pre-washed and half-dried. The pigeons on the roof were already arguing again, which somehow felt reassuring. As Aldrich sat up, creaking slightly in places where people were not supposed to creak, he remembered the pouch of herbs and the slip of questions he had received from the apothecary. The questions still made no sense, and the herbs had yet to be brewed, not for lack of interest, but because the kettle in the tavern's upstairs hall had last been used, by all appearances, as a foot warmer for a particularly cold sheep. Nevertheless, Aldrich tucked both into his satchel and made his way down the narrow, groaning stairs toward the tavern's hearth-room, where the stew was already plotting its daily appearance. The tavern was quieter than usual. Jaren was nowhere to be seen. The barkeep was outside, stacking firewood with the resigned energy of a man who had once dreamed of becoming a troubadour, and the few remaining patrons were engaged in that peculiar medieval tradition of communal silence, everyone sharing space while pretending not to notice anyone else. Aldrich approached the counter and requested, somewhat hesitantly, access to water, not to drink, but to clean. The barkeep, never one to pass up an opportunity to look confused and faintly put upon, gestured toward a wooden tub out back and muttered something about soap being a suggestion more than a rule. With this ringing endorsement, Aldrich collected a small bar that smelled of basil and fatigue and made his way into the narrow courtyard behind the mild comfort. There he found the tub, half filled with rainwater and ambition, and a rickety bench upon which rested a forgotten pair of trousers and a sock with dreams of becoming something else entirely. He began by attempting to remove the worst of the grime from his tunic using a method passed down from his grandmother: soak, sigh, scrub, repeat. The water quickly turned a color best described as medieval. It seemed to have opinions. As he worked slowly and with the solemn care of a man hand-washing his own dignity, Aldrich thought again about the questions from the apothecary. Does your sadness wear shoes? It was an absurd notion, but as he wrung out a sleeve that still smelled of stew, he found himself imagining what kind of shoes his sadness might wear. Not boots, too purposeful. Not sandals, too hopeful. Perhaps soft, worn slippers, the kind that shuffled rather than stepped. Yes, his sadness definitely shuffled. With that revelation achieved, he rinsed the tunic one final time and hung it on the line that stretched from one crooked fence post to another, joining several other articles of clothing from fellow guests, each piece telling its own story of road dust, spilled broth, and indifference. As the garments dripped rhythmically in the breeze, Aldrich sat on the bench and allowed the quiet to settle over him. He noticed a small toad beneath the tub, its eyes wide and unbothered, as if it too had come seeking peace and possibly a nap. Nearby, a thin trail of ants made its way around the edge of the yard with the coordinated effort of a guild, each ant clearly knowing its role and not questioning its place in the grand design. Aldrich envied them slightly. He reached into his satchel and withdrew the pouch of herbs. With no kettle at hand, he placed the bundle near his face and inhaled. The scent was earthy, bitter, and oddly grounding. He did not feel better, not exactly, but he felt anchored, like a boat tied to a quiet dock, even if the tide still pulled. The questions, still folded neatly, remained untouched for now. By midday, his clothes were dry enough to be classified as wearable in a charitable court of law, and he redressed with the hesitance of someone trying on a memory. Back inside the tavern, the barkeep offered him bread that had been recently warmed and soup that had recently stopped boiling, both of which Aldrich accepted with gratitude shaped like silence. The seat by the window was open, and as he resumed his place beneath the watchful eyes of pigeons and clouds, he considered whether to continue south, return north, or simply stay another day and see if his dreams caught up. The door creaked open, and in stepped a young man, no older than 20, wearing a tunic too clean for travel and an expression full of concern and confusion. He looked around, spotted Aldrich, and approached with the uncertain energy of someone delivering news they were not entirely sure was theirs to give. "Are you the one who left the village last week?" he asked, voice soft but urgent. Aldrich, mouth full of warm bread, paused, swallowed, then nodded. "Matilda sent me," the boy said. "She says to tell you, she says to ask if you're planning to finish the roof before winter or if she should hire the goat instead." Aldrich blinked. A pause stretched between them, and then he nodded again, slower this time. "Tell her the goat has better balance," he replied. The boy grinned, unsure whether it was a joke, but deciding to treat it like one anyway. "She also sent this," he added, producing a wrapped bundle. Aldrich took it and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a second tunic, his other one, patched and slightly moth-eaten, but familiar in that way only worn cloth can be. It smelled of home, which meant it smelled faintly of soap, mud, and Matilda's tendency to overuse rosemary in everything. He held it for a moment, then folded it and placed it gently on the table. The boy waited, fidgeting slightly, until Aldrich gestured for him to sit. "You might as well eat," Aldrich said. "The stew always improves after the first bowl. Or at least stops getting worse." The boy laughed, and for a few minutes the silence in the tavern took a different shape, less heavy, more curious. And as they sat there beneath pigeons, beneath clouds, Aldrich found himself asking one of the questions from the slip of paper, not aloud, but inwardly, quietly, the way one asks the wind whether it remembers where it's been. The boy's name, as it turned out, was Elric, though he admitted it with the kind of shrug that suggested he hadn't had much opportunity to be called anything important yet. He ate his stew with the speed of someone recently acquainted with hunger, and entirely unconcerned with the stew's murky lineage. Aldrich watched him in the quiet way a man does when trying to decide if this youth with his two big sleeves and hopeful eyebrows was truly part of his life or merely passing through it like a misplaced chapter. When Elbrick was done wiping his mouth with the sleeve that had seen better manners, he pulled from his satchel a small folded parchment. "She wrote something too," he said, as if unsure whether written communication between spouses was entirely allowed. The letter was brief, as her writings often were, composed in a hand that suggested confidence and a quill that had been chewed upon. It read, "Aldrich, if you've found peace, don't rush back. If you've only found pigeons, bring a few. The roof still leaks, the goat ate your shoes, and the wind has found the hole in the wall again. There's a pot of something on, and a place for you beside it." Aldrich read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his satchel beside the pouch of herbs and the questions. He stared out the window for a long moment, watching the pigeons settle into the rhythms of midday sunbathing and light bickering. Elric, sensing something, remained quiet, which was a rare gift in a young messenger and possibly a skill learned from growing up near Matilda. Later that afternoon, Aldrich borrowed a ladder from the barkeep, who gave it up with a grunt and a warning that it had one honest rung and several that only pretended. With Elric in tow and the innkeeper's dog providing occasional commentary in the form of suspicious growls, they made their way to the side of the tavern where the roof sloped down just low enough to suggest hope. Eldrich's reason for this sudden architectural endeavor wasn't entirely clear, even to himself, Perhaps it was the mention of the leaky roof at home, or the faint smell of sap in the air, or maybe just the fact that his hands itched for something solid to hold that wasn't metaphorical or made of boiled cloth. Climbing the ladder was an act of faith, not in the ladder certainly, but in the idea that if he fell, someone would at least notice before the third day. Each step creaked with its own private monologue. When he reached the top, the view was mostly chimney smoke and clouds shaped like thoughts he hadn't had yet. He sat on the edge carefully, legs dangling like laundry on a windless day, and took in the slow movements of the village. A woman carrying turnips paused to adjust her basket. A child ran past, chasing something only children could see. The apothecary emerged from his crooked shop to feed a squirrel with a level of seriousness normally reserved for courtship or tax disputes. Elric climbed up beside him, more nimble but far less confident, and sat awkwardly, his knees pulled up like he expected a sermon or a storm. "What are we fixing?" he asked after a while, squinting at the tiles. Aldrich smiled faintly. "Not the roof," he said. "But it's good to look like we are." Elric nodded, as if that made perfect sense. They sat in silence, watching clouds drift across the sky like indecisive sheep. After a time, Aldrich spoke again. "I used to think the sky was a lid," he said, "that if you climbed high enough, you could tap on it, and someone might answer." Elric looked at him, unsure whether this was a joke or a poem. "Did anyone?" he asked. Aldrich shook his head. "Not yet. But I haven't stopped knocking." The wind picked up slightly, stirring loose a few leaves and one particularly aggressive shingle, which flew off into the distance with the grace of a startled duck. Elric laughed, short and sudden. "That one resigned," he said. Aldrich chuckled in return. "I respect its decision." For the next hour they patched what they could with bits of wood and logic, replacing loose tiles and pressing their fingers against the soft places where rain had left its signature. It was not expert work, but it was shared, and for a time that was more than enough. When they climbed down, the ladder protested again, but not maliciously. Back inside, they warmed their hands by the hearth, where the stew was now entering its contemplative stage, emitting the kind of steam that suggested it had become self-aware. Aldrich reached into his satchel and pulled out the pouch of herbs, finally steeping them in a pot borrowed from the kitchen. The scent that rose was both grounding and strange, like soil that had been taught to dream. He poured 2 cups and handed one to Elric, who sniffed it and looked wary. "It smells like bedtime and rain," he said. Aldrich nodded. "It's meant to. Drink slowly and think about nothing in particular." They drank. Outside, the sky darkened just enough to hint at evening. The pigeons had quieted. The innkeeper's dog lay asleep under the bench, twitching gently. Elric reached into his own bag and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. "Matilda said to give you this if you seem tired," he said. Aldrich took it and unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small wooden carving, rough, uneven, but unmistakably meant to be a goat. Its eyes were slightly crooked, its stance unsure, but it had been made with care. He turned it over in his hands, a smile forming before he realized it. "She said it should remind you of the shrine," Elric added. "And to take yourself less seriously." Aldrich placed the carving beside his cup and looked out the window again. The clouds were still moving, slower now, like they too had tired of their performance. He leaned back, closed his eyes briefly, and imagined the questions from the slip of paper drifting in the air around him like moths. One landed gently. "Where does your quiet go when you sleep?" He didn't have an answer, but he liked the way it felt, sitting there beside him, warm as tea, soft as wood, and shaped a little like home. The following morning rose slowly, like bread left near a lukewarm hearth, and Aldrich greeted it with the familiar sensation of having slept, but only in the most technical sense. His body had remained horizontal for several hours, but his mind had taken the opportunity to wander through every mistake he had made since age 12, pausing occasionally to critique his posture and speculate on whether goats were capable of holding grudges. Elric had already gone, dispatched with a fresh bundle of messages for nearby villages and a small loaf of bread that looked surprised to be included. Aldrich, left alone in the tavern with only the innkeeper and the cat who now fully believed it lived there, decided that perhaps a walk was necessary, not for any particular reason, but because the alternative was sitting still long enough for melancholy to find a comfortable place to perch again. With the wooden goat tucked into his satchel and the pouch of herbs crinkling softly with each step, he made his way through the sleepy lanes of gray weather, which smelled faintly of moss, yeast, and the quiet conviction that rain was only pretending not to arrive. Beyond the village, a narrow path led into what the locals called the Whispering Field, though no one could quite agree on what it whispered or why it did so only when no one was listening. The path was framed by low stone walls that had once demarcated something important, perhaps ownership, perhaps sheep, but now served mostly as seating for birds with strong opinions. The field itself was wide and gently sloped, filled with tall grasses that moved with the wind like a congregation in a slow, contemplative sermon. Aldrich stepped into it and immediately felt the change in air. The way sound softened and thoughts became less spiky. The field didn't speak in words, of course, but it hummed gently, as if the earth itself was remembering an old lullaby and wasn't quite ready to stop. He walked slowly, letting his fingers brush the tops of the grass, which tickled and occasionally snagged like curious whispers. The sky was an expanse of gentle gray, broken here and there by strips of pale light, like an old parchment torn to let the sun peek through. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out with the confidence of a herald and the accuracy of someone guessing. Aldrich did not answer. Instead, he sat on a large flat stone near the center of the field, worn smooth by years of contemplation, or at least by sheep. From this spot, the village seemed like something imagined, a cluster of roofs and habits nestled against a hill. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the folded parchment of questions from the apothecary. It had grown slightly creased and stained with herb dust, but the words remained sharp. He read another one aloud, softly. If your sadness could talk, would it whisper or shout? The grass rustled, not in response but in rhythm, and he leaned back on his elbows, letting the wind pass over him like an idea he didn't need to finish. Sometime later, though he had no interest in measuring it, a figure appeared along the path, walking with the uneven gait of someone who had recently argued with footwear. The figure, a woman in a deep green cloak with a feather tucked behind her ear, stopped a few feet away and looked at Aldrich with the squint of one assessing the difference between a farmer and a philosophical mistake. "You're sitting on the stone that sometimes hums," she said, matter-of-factly. Aldrich looked down. "I thought it was just warm." She tilted her head. "It does that too, but only when it rains 3 days in a row and someone nearby is thinking about bread." Aldrich blinked. "That's specific." She nodded. "Nature's rarely general. You must be the man from the tavern." He raised an eyebrow. "Is it that obvious?" She sat beside him without invitation, adjusting her cloak in a way that suggested it had strong feelings about folds. "Only a few people come here on purpose. The rest arrive by accident or emotional detour. You're clearly detouring." Aldrich smiled faintly, more from confusion than amusement. "Do you live nearby?" he asked. "Close enough to hear when the wind changes direction," she replied, which didn't answer the question but did close the subject effectively. They sat together in silence for a while, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the distant bark of a dog arguing with its own existence. Eventually, she pulled from her pouch a collection of folded leaves tied with string. "These are wind maps," she explained. "I collect them when I walk. Every breeze has a story, and if you hold the leaves right, you can read them." Aldrich accepted one gingerly, holding it up to the light. It looked like an ordinary leaf, though slightly more earnest. "What does this one say?" he he asked. She studied it. Mostly complaints about traveling uphill and a fondness for chimney smoke. Relatable. They exchanged no names, which felt appropriate. Some meetings were meant to remain unlabeled, like dreams or forgotten recipes. As the sun began to tilt westward, Aldrich realized he had no idea how long he'd been sitting there or why his shoulders felt lighter. The woman stood, brushed grass from her knees, and offered him a final leaf. "This one's for when the wind stops. Keep it in your satchel just in case you forget which way your thoughts were headed." He accepted it with a nod, tucking it beside the goat, the herbs, and the questions. Without another word, she walked back down the path, disappearing into the folds of the field like a sentence returned to a book. Aldrich remained a while longer, eyes closed, listening not for answers, but for the space where questions liked to breathe. The sky above shifted subtly, the kind of shift that only matters to people who still believe in weather as a conversation. He lay back fully on the stone and let the wind trace gentle paths across his face, wondering idly what story this particular breeze had carried before it found him. When Aldrich finally stood from the humming stone, his back issued a creak that sounded like the floorboards of a haunted chapel deciding whether to forgive you. The sun, in its indecisive late-afternoon slump, cast long shadows over the whispering field, stretching the grass into elongated confessions. He made his way slowly back toward Greyweather. The wind now settled into a gentler rhythm, as if it had shared all its stories for the day and was content to just tag along. In his satchel, the leaf from the cloaked woman nestled against the folded questions and the wooden goat, forming what was, at this point, a kind of portable confusion kit. The village looked almost theatrical as he returned, lit with the honeyed light of a sun that had recently remembered its job. A few villagers lingered near doorways, discussing turnips, geese, or taxes with the same tone used for minor tragedies. Aldrich, feeling neither urgent nor entirely grounded, wandered past the tavern, past the apothecary's gently leaning door, and paused before a building he hadn't noticed before. It was tucked between a cobbler's shop that hadn't sold shoes in 2 years and a small stable used exclusively by animals with personality disorders. The building had no sign, but its door was slightly ajar and a faint smell of paper, candle wax, and patience wafted out. Intrigued by the scent and the notion of unexpected rooms, Aldrich pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. What greeted him was not so much a library as a well-meaning accumulation of thoughts. Shelves, none of them uniform, leaned in unpredictable directions, burdened by scrolls, folios, pamphlets, ledgers, and the occasional book that looked like it was pretending to be important. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slipping through high, narrow windows. A large clock ticked noisily on the back wall, though the hands moved at slightly different speeds, as if they disagreed on the very concept of time. A woman emerged from behind a curtain of beaded string, her hair wrapped in a scarf that may have once been a map. She regarded Aldrich with the expression of someone who knew exactly how many candles were currently lit in the room and was deeply unimpressed by all of them. "You're early," she said, though he hadn't been expected at all. "I haven't prepared the argument on goats and free will." Aldrich blinked. "I'm sorry, I think Oh, it's not him," she interrupted, peering more closely. "No matter. Are you looking for something alphabetical or interpretive?" "I don't know," he admitted. "That's the right answer," she said. "Follow me." She led him down an aisle between shelves marked with symbols that may have been runes or accidental ink spills. They passed a chair piled with unread letters, a globe missing half of Europe, and a table with nothing on it but a pair of glasses and a jar labeled "Spare Thoughts." At a corner where the floor sloped upward for reasons no one had fixed, she stopped. "This is the shelf for minds that wander more than they walk. You'll find stories here that begin in the middle, end in the footnotes, and have no interest in making a point." Aldrich reached for a narrow book bound in blue cloth. It opened with a sigh and smelled of chamomile. The pages inside were filled with lists, some poetic, some absurd, all clearly written by someone who needed to name everything before forgetting it. There were entries like ideas that arrived too late for breakfast, feelings that wore the wrong shoes, and Wednesday thoughts that pretended to be Fridays. He read for some time, the ticking clock behind him keeping uneven pace. The librarian returned eventually with 2 mugs of something steaming and handed him one. Tea made from indecisive herbs, she said. It helps the brain settle into comfortable confusion. He sipped. It tasted like mint, lavender, and a hint of rain. This place, he began, not quite sure how to finish. Doesn't require a reason, she said, waving vaguely. It's here for those who don't know what they're looking for and find something else instead. They talked, or more accurately, they exchanged semi-related observations which felt like the appropriate rhythm of conversation for this place. Aldrich mentioned the shrine, the goat, the wind maps, and the leaf meant for when thoughts forget their direction. The librarian, who referred to herself only as Minnow, no explanation offered or sought, nodded in all the right places and once asked whether he thought melancholy was a kind of weather or a form of punctuation. He didn't know, but promised to consider it. As the light dimmed further, she directed him to a small table near the back where a book lay open, filled with blank pages. "For guests," she said. "Write anything. Or nothing. Just don't cross out. This place is allergic to erasure." Aldrich sat and stared at the blank page. For a while, he wrote nothing. Then he wrote slowly. Not a story, not a memory, but something like breath translated into ink. He wrote about the field that whispered but didn't explain itself, about the pigeon arguments, about Matilda's rosemary, and the way sadness sometimes borrowed his boots without asking. He wrote until his hand ached gently and the page no longer felt empty. When he looked up, Minnow was gone, replaced by a small cat that sat on the shelf labeled Contemplative Accidents. It blinked at him as if waiting for a quote. He left the book open, placed the pen beside it, and wandered back through the shelves, out the door, into the dusky street. The clock inside ticked once as he passed, loudly and, for just a moment, in unison. Outside, the air had cooled, the breeze carried a thread of rosemary and wood smoke, and the stars had begun their slow, indifferent emergence. He walked without purpose through the village, past the tavern, toward the edge where the road led back into fields and eventually somewhere else. He paused, once, beneath the lamppost that flickered with the effort of continuing. The satchel on his shoulder felt a little heavier with words, or maybe just more honest. Somewhere inside it, the leaf of forgotten direction rested against the questions that still made no sense. And ahead, the road continued, uneven, unhurried, quietly insisting that something waited beyond the next gentle bend. Aldrich didn't set out that night with intention so much as with a general leaning. The road beyond Greyweather was barely a road at all, more a suggestion that people had once agreed to walk the same way and left a trail behind out of politeness. The lanterns, set sporadically on crooked posts, offered just enough light to discourage deep thoughts, but not enough to fully illuminate one's boots. Aldrich appreciated this ambiguity. The air was cool and damp, the sort of temperature that made one aware of one's elbows for no practical reason. Crickets offered a commentary that was not especially insightful but persistent, and somewhere far off a nightbird made the kind of call that suggested it was still debating the value of its own voice. After some time, or perhaps no time at all since the road wasn't keeping track, Aldrich noticed a faint blue glow ahead, not lantern light, but something softer, more like moonlight that had been left to steep. As he approached, the source revealed itself to be a small hut, square and symmetrical, which was suspicious in and of itself. Everything else in the region leaned slightly or bulged unexpectedly, but this hut sat like a bookend against the sloping world, framed by a ring of stones and a garden that grew only silver-leaved plants. Outside stood a man in a dark cloak with a hood pulled back to reveal hair the color of ash and eyes that looked as though they had once been more comfortable in the dark. He held a staff, not for walking, but for balance of a different sort, and in his other hand a lantern filled not with flame, but with a gently swirling mist that pulsed with slow intent. "You're just in time," the man said, as though Aldrich had been invited. "The fog's about to turn." Aldrich paused, unsure whether this was metaphor, warning, or invitation. "Turn where?" he asked. The man tilted his head, the way birds do when deciding if you're edible. "That depends entirely on whether it likes you." He gestured to a bench beside the path, one carved from driftwood, though no one in Greyweather had mentioned a sea. Aldrich sat without questioning further, which he was becoming increasingly good at. The man placed the mist lantern on a post and retrieved a brass instrument from a pouch at his waist. It resembled a compass, but the needle spun in lazy circles, pausing only when Aldrich breathed too hard. "This measures fog intention," the man explained, "not direction. That's a common mistake. Fog doesn't go somewhere. It decides to be somewhere." Aldrich nodded solemnly, as if he'd known this and simply forgotten. "And you measure that?" "I try," the man replied. "I know when it arrives. I know when it forgets to leave. I listen to what it doesn't say." As if to prove a point, the mist thickened around them, not with menace, but with familiarity, like a blanket that remembered being a cloud. The hut disappeared behind a veil of gentle gray, and Aldrich could just make out the shape of the garden plants exhaling politely. "Most people find it unsettling," the man continued, "not knowing what they can't see, but I find it calming. The fog levels everything. Castles and cottages look the same when you squint hard enough. It gives the world permission to blur." "And maybe that's why I'm here," Aldrich said slowly. "Because I've been too sharp for too long." "Or not sharp enough," the man offered. "Both are exhausting." They sat in the quiet a while, the fog now so complete it seemed to hum. Aldrich's thoughts drifted not in panic, but in a soft spiral. He thought of Matilda and her insistence that roofs leak, not because of rain, but because people forget to listen to the wood. He thought of Brother Egbert, who believed in walking as a cure for anything the church couldn't reach. He thought of Elric, somewhere out there in the world with his messages and his optimism tucked into sleeves far too long. The man stood suddenly, not with alarm, but with the fluid grace of someone who knew how the fog would move before it did. "It's lifting," he said. "Not all at once, of course. That would be rude, but enough to resume shapes." And sure enough, the path reappeared slowly like a memory returning. The hut became visible again, symmetrical and watchful. The man retrieved the lantern, now still and clear, the mist within folded like parchment. "You should keep this," he said, handing the lantern to Aldrich. "It won't light your way, but it might remind you that clarity is sometimes optional." Aldrich took it carefully, the weight slight but significant. "Thank you," he said, "because anything more would be decoration." The man nodded once, turned, and walked into the hut without sound, the door closing behind him with a finality that suggested it wouldn't open again until the fog had a new story to tell. Aldrich resumed his walk, now holding the lantern gently in both hands, watching the last threads of mist curl around his boots and then disappear. The road widened slightly as it turned, revealing a fork he hadn't seen before. One path led downward into a hollow lined with dark trees. The other curved upward, where the horizon caught a faint glimmer of dawn not yet committed. He paused, not to choose, but to appreciate the luxury of choosing. The questions from the apothecary fluttered quietly in his mind. "If your direction forgets you, will you follow it anyway?" He smiled without meaning to, then stepped forward, not with certainty, but with presence. And just ahead, the wind stirred once more, carrying the scent of cedar, damp stone, and something else he couldn't name, but might one day recognize. Aldrich chose the downward path, not out of logic or even preference, but because the lantern in his hands seemed to tilt slightly in that direction, and he had begun to trust objects more than intentions. The air cooled as he descended, the morning light thinning into a soft veil that filtered through branches bent by age or uncertainty. The road narrowed into a trail, its edges softened by moss and the occasional scatter of stones that looked vaguely accusatory. Birdsong returned, hesitantly at first, as if negotiating its right to be heard after a night of silence, and Aldrich followed the tune without asking it for directions. He passed under arches of trees that had grown tired of growing upward and now leaned toward one another like neighbors sharing gossip about rainfall. The lantern, though no longer glowing, remained warm to the touch, as if remembering the fog it had once held. Occasionally, Aldrich glanced down to ensure it hadn't turned back into something more ordinary, like a jar of misplaced breath or a fancy soup container. It hadn't, though he wasn't sure it couldn't. The hollow arrived gradually, announced not by a sudden change in scenery, but by a subtle shift in sound, or rather, the lack of it. The birds fell quiet. The wind, previously a chatty companion, seemed to hold its breath. Even the rustle of Aldrich's own footsteps grew muffled, as if the earth beneath him had lined itself with wool. It wasn't silence exactly, but a peculiar absence, a hush that didn't ask for reverence, but simply didn't allow interruptions. In the center of the hollow stood a small structure shaped like a bell turned upside down, made of wood and stone and something else that refused to be categorized. Aldrich approached slowly, his boots crunching the gravel with a softness that made no sense. The door was open, but only slightly, which by now he understood to be the universal invitation for mildly reluctant visitors. He stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit by slits in the roof that allowed in slices of daylight like paper cuttings. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with books or herbs, but with jars. Dozens of jars, each sealed tightly and labeled with words so faint they could have been wishes or warnings. Some were filled with what appeared to be mist, others with small tokens, feathers, pebbles, even fragments of thread. And then there were those that seemed entirely empty, though their labels read things like first laugh in autumn, argument about socks, and wind that changed its mind. A low table occupied the center of the room, beside which sat a woman in a chair that looked remarkably like a tree stump pretending to be furniture. She wore a cloak stitched with patches of sound waves, though Aldrich couldn't explain how he recognized them as such. Her face was calm, lined with the kind of experience that might come from listening to storms rather than weathering them. She looked up as he entered, offering neither greeting nor question, just an acknowledgement. Aldrich nodded, unsure of the custom here. "I wasn't sure if I should come in," he offered. Aldrich wasn't entirely certain, but he nodded anyway. She picked up one of the jars, held it to her ear, and smiled faintly. "This one is full of goodbye footsteps. They echo longer than most sounds." "Do you collect them?" he asked. "Not exactly," she replied. "They find me. People leave them behind when they don't realize they've said something worth keeping." She offered him a small jar, unsealed. "Listen." He held it close and after a moment heard it, a soft rustle like fabric being folded carefully, followed by a low chuckle that might have belonged to a memory. It faded, but not completely. "That one's a sigh of relief from someone who didn't know they were holding their breath," she said. Aldrich stared at the jar, then gently set it down. "Why keep these?" She tilted her head. "Because people forget. They think sound is only for ears, but some sounds are stories. Not the kind with plots, but the kind that settle into your bones and tell you who you are." "I don't think I have any sounds to trade." She raised an eyebrow. "Everyone does. Some carry entire orchestras of unspoken words. Others have only the squeak of a door they never opened. All are welcome." From a small drawer in the table, she pulled out a slender scroll and handed it to him. It contained a list, written in ink that shimmered faintly. At the top it said, "Sounds you might be missing." The entries were simple, curious. A pause before truth, the second breath after waking, laughter you almost joined, the silence after someone changed their mind. Aldrich read them slowly, feeling each one land somewhere just behind his ribs. What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Or everything. That's entirely up to the pace of your listening." He stayed there for a while, sipping a tea that appeared without ceremony and tasted like forgotten songs. When he rose to leave, she handed him a small jar sealed with wax and a ribbon. "Don't open it until you've walked far enough that your thoughts forget to follow," she said. "Then listen." He tucked the jar carefully into his satchel, nestling it among the others, and stepped outside. The hollow still hummed with a quiet that understood how to wait. As he made his way back up the path, the air regained its usual texture. A bird chirped once, experimentally, then again with more confidence. The wind stirred gently, brushing the back of his neck with a reminder that directions, like stories, often turned when least expected. By the time Aldrich returned to the main path, the sun had shifted into that particular angle where shadows lengthen not with menace, but with a kind of lazy curiosity. He walked slowly, not because he was tired, though he was, but because something about the hollow had adjusted his pace. The path beneath his feet felt more like suggestion than surface, and his thoughts had scattered pleasantly into smaller, less urgent fragments. The jar in his satchel pulsed with quiet weight, nestled beside the questions, the leaf, and the goat that now smelled faintly of tea. The forest thinned gradually, giving way to open land dotted with stunted trees and grass that bent in the wind as if unsure how to stand properly. Ahead, beside a bend in the road that no map had bothered to notice, sat a bench. It was not ornate or even symmetrical. Its legs were uneven, and its backrest leaned like it had grown weary of witnessing things. But it was solid, and more importantly, it was present. Aldrich approached, and, without thinking too hard, sat down. The bench creaked, not in protest, but in familiarity. It was the kind of seat that had been waiting, not for him specifically, but for someone with enough stillness left in their bones to hear what sitting had to say. The air here was cool and faintly sweet, touched with the scent of pine and loam, and something warm that had long since cooled. Aldrich leaned back, letting the road unwind ahead of him like a ribbon someone had chosen not to tie. The jar in his satchel, still unopened, nudged gently against his side. He considered it, but let it be. Sounds, like memories, preferred to arrive uninvited. A few feet away, a rabbit emerged from the underbrush, looked at Aldrich with the wary gaze of a creature used to being misunderstood, and began to clean its face with brisk, impatient strokes. It was a kind of ritual, Aldrich thought, one that required no witnesses but performed with dignity nonetheless. Clouds gathered overhead, slow and aimless, like retirees browsing a familiar market. The promise of rain hung in the air, not heavy, not urgent, but persistent, like an idea that hasn't yet found words, and yet no drops fell. Aldrich waited, not for the rain exactly, but for the moment when waiting felt like enough. The questions came to mind again. If your patience had a color, would it match your regrets? He didn't know. Maybe. Maybe it would look like the sky, pale and slightly bruised, carrying more meaning than certainty. A crunch of footsteps interrupted his musing, and he looked up to see an elderly man approaching, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with what appeared to be precisely sorted pine cones. The man paused when he reached the bench and eyed Aldrich with polite suspicion. "Mind if I share the bench?" he asked, though he was already setting down the barrow and easing himself beside Aldrich with the sigh of someone practiced in joint negotiation. "Not at all," Aldrich replied, shifting slightly. They sat for a while in silence, punctuated only by the distant rustle of leaves and the sound of pine cones settling. "Used to be," the old man began, "this bench was known for predicting weather. Not very accurately, mind you. but enthusiastically. Aldrich smiled. And what does it say today? Like a rooster that only crows after the sun's already up. They sat a little longer, listening to the not quite rain. The man gestured toward the wheelbarrow. These are sorting pine cones, not for burning or display, just for organizing. Why? Aldrich asked, genuinely curious. The man shrugged. Some days your thoughts won't sit still, but pine cones will. Helps to hold one while the others sort themselves. He offered Aldrich a medium-sized specimen, rounded and slightly squashed on one end. Aldrich turned it over in his hands. It felt steady. What do you them after? Put them back in the forest, the man said. They go on with their lives a bit more centered. Or so I like to think. Aldrich nodded, unsure whether it was a metaphor or just a local tradition. Possibly both. After a time, the old man rose, gathered his wheelbarrow, and nodded farewell. If the rain starts, it won't last. That's its way of apologizing. Aldrich watched him go, the sound of the wheelbarrow wheels becoming part of the landscape. He turned back to the horizon and reached into his satchel. The jar was still warm. He removed it carefully, peeled back the wax seal, and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, gently, unmistakably, the sound of rain, not falling but arriving, the hush before the first drop, the slight intake of breath from leaves, the anticipation. It filled the air around him without changing the weather, like a ghost performing a memory. He closed his eyes and listened to the rain that hadn't yet begun. Aldrich sat with his eyes closed for longer than he meant to, listening to the soft presence of the rain. That wasn't its gentle arrival, held not in droplets but in intention. The sound from the jar faded slowly like the end of a lullaby. No one wanted to stop singing, and he waited for real rain to follow. It didn't. The sky remained solemn and undecided, its clouds lingering like guests too polite to leave, but too bored to stay. When Aldrich opened his eyes, the light had shifted again, sliding toward the muted gold of a late afternoon that had nothing else scheduled. He tucked the now quiet jar back into his satchel next to the pine cone, which he hadn't realized he'd kept, and stood up slowly, offering the bench a small nod of thanks. The bench, of course, said nothing, but the breeze that rustled through the grass seemed to acknowledge him all the same. The path ahead was less distinct now, partly because the landscape had changed, and partly because Aldrich wasn't entirely sure whether he was following the road or the space beside it. The ground sloped upward, not sharply, but with the persistence of a hill that had long ago decided to be a mountain, and then changed its mind. Aldrich walked without haste, guided more by the shape of the land than by any particular destination. The sky above grumbled faintly, not with thunder, but with the internal argument of clouds unsure whether to commit to precipitation. Eventually, he came upon a fork, less dramatic than a crossroads, more like two sheep paths that had stopped agreeing with each other. One side wound downward into what looked like marshland, soggy and contemplative. The other rose gently toward a ridge where a figure stood near a tree, adjusting something on an easel. Aldrich took the higher path, drawn less by curiosity than by a desire for clearer footing. As he approached, he saw that the figure was a woman with a thick braid, coiled like a sleeping cat atop her head, wearing a cloak speckled with ink marks. The easel sported a large map, unfinished and sprawling, its edges curling in the wind. She held a brush in one hand and a compass in the other, not the kind for directions, but for drawing circles. Nearby, a table balanced precariously on 3 legs, covered in rolls of parchment, measuring strings, and what appeared to be a half-eaten apple trying to convince itself it was still worth finishing. She looked up as he approached and gave him a professional nod. If you've come for directions, I can only offer speculative geography. Aldrich smiled. Speculative is usually more useful than accurate. She gestured toward the map. I chart forgotten places. Not lost exactly, just not remembered by the people who might have mattered to them. Paths abandoned, bridges that were once hopeful, towns that decided they were better off as fields. You'd be surprised how many of them still linger. Why map them? He asked. She tapped her brush against her lip, leaving a small dot of ink. Because memory needs landmarks. If no one names the bends and hollows, how will the mind ever return? She pointed to a spot on the map that looked like a smear, but upon closer inspection was labeled field where regrets reschedule themselves. Aldrich stepped closer, scanning the surface. The map was beautiful in an uneven, contemplative way. Not linear, not even entirely topographical, but suggestive, filled with tiny notes in the margins. Here, the wind forgets your name. Don't trust the stones near this stream. And once someone waited here without expecting anything. Have you ever gotten lost on your own map? He asked. Only when I follow it too closely, she replied. She unrolled a smaller sheet and offered it to him. It was blank, save a dotted line and a simple heading, the places you almost visited. You can add to it, she said, but only places you nearly went and didn't. It's good to remember the almosts. He accepted it carefully, tucking it into his satchel where it immediately took its place among the other oddities like a well-behaved thought. As the wind shifted, she gathered her tools with practiced movements, storing ink bottles in a case shaped like a birdhouse and rolling her maps with reverence. There's a place just beyond the ridge, she said as she packed. Not on any official record. But it's there if you don't look directly at it. They say it collects dreams that change their minds halfway through. And what's it called? Aldrich asked. It doesn't say, she replied, but it answers to gentle footsteps. She slung the map case over her shoulder, picked up the table as though it weighed nothing, and disappeared behind a bend in the path, her cloak catching the wind like a story about to begin again. Aldrich stood alone for a moment longer, holding the half-map of almosts, and looked toward the ridge. The light now had the softness of twilight reconsidered, and the road ahead shimmered faintly with the invitation of places not meant to be known but remembered anyway. He adjusted the satchel on his shoulder, feeling the reassuring bump of the pine cone, the jar, the leaf, the goat, and the weightless scroll. Then he stepped forward, not directly toward the hidden place, but at the angle that might suggest he wasn't entirely trying to avoid it either. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the sky exhaled, not rain, not wind, but something quieter, something like patience. The incline to the ridge was gentle in the way that time sometimes is, almost imperceptible until one looks back and realizes they've climbed without noticing. Aldrich moved slowly, more out of consideration for the view than any particular fatigue, although his legs did voice mild complaints at intervals. The sky above had shifted again, no longer brooding but not yet celebratory. A kind of emotional limbo usually reserved for birthdays one tries not to mention. At the crest of the ridge, he paused, not because the view demanded it, though it did, but because something in the air suggested pausing was appropriate. The land ahead dipped into a hollow not marked by signpost or path, its edges blurred by low mist that clung to the ground like a secret. It was exactly as the cartographer had said, a place that refused direct attention but revealed itself when one looked slightly to the left or right, like a thought waiting for the right distraction. Aldrich adjusted his satchel, checked that the jar was secure, and stepped down into the unmarked place. The air grew still immediately, not oppressive, but deliberate, as though the trees lining the basin had agreed to hold their breath while he passed. The ground beneath his boots was soft but not wet, covered in a layer of leaves that seemed to have fallen centuries ago and chosen to stay out of politeness. As he walked deeper into the hollow, sounds returned slowly, the gentle rustle of unseen creatures, the occasional pop of a distant twig reconsidering its integrity, and a faint humming that might have been wind or memory or neither. Something had happened here or was still in the process of happening, quietly and without deadline. In the center of the hollow sat a large stone, smooth and wide, like a table for ideas rather than meals. On it lay objects, simple ones, a spool of thread, a cracked mug, a key without a lock, and a small notebook with no title. Aldrich approached slowly, as one does when confronting a mystery that has decided not to be urgent. He picked up the notebook. The pages were filled with beginnings. Each page started with a sentence, a paragraph, sometimes even a full page before stopping abruptly mid-thought. No endings, no conclusions. Just thoughts paused like people mid-step in a room where they'd forgotten their reason for entering. He sat on the edge of the stone and removed the scroll the cartographer had given him, the one labeled Places You Almost Visited. He unrolled it slowly, noting that it had somehow added 3 new entries in the time since he tucked it away: the tower you passed in fog but never saw, the room in your home you once locked by accident and never unlocked again, and this. He smiled faintly and traced his fingers along the parchment, wondering if he was supposed to add something now, or if simply noticing was enough. The stone beneath him hummed faintly, or maybe it was just his own breath catching the rhythm of the place. Without fully intending to, he removed the jar from his satchel, the one given by the soundkeeper in the hollow, and held it in both hands. It was still warm, not with temperature, but with anticipation. He opened it gently, and the sound that emerged was not a sound exactly, but a sensation, the feeling of waking from a dream not finished, the echo of a story one meant to tell, but never found the beginning for. It lingered in the air like mist, shaping itself around the stone, brushing against the trees, then dissolving into something that felt suspiciously like comfort. He closed the jar again, not to seal it, but to say thank you. Just beyond the stone, a path revealed itself not by changing the landscape, but by making its presence known to Aldrich's feet. It curved gently, almost shyly, into a grove of trees that leaned slightly inward, forming a kind of arch that suggested either welcome or curiosity. He stood, stretching with the slow resolve of someone who had nowhere to be but plenty to consider, and followed the path. The notebook of unfinished beginnings remained on the stone, open to a page that simply said he hadn't planned to stay, but the air convinced him otherwise. Aldrich didn't take it with him, but he did leave something behind, nothing physical, but a thought shaped like a question and folded gently into the space above the stone. The trees received it without fanfare, and the mist, as always, said nothing but lingered just long enough to be remembered. The grove ahead was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that pushed things away. It was the quiet that made room, wide and gentle and patient, like a library that had long since stopped expecting visitors but kept the books in order anyway. Aldrich passed under the arched trees, each branch bowed slightly as though eavesdropping on the path without judgment. The ground here was covered not in grass but in soft moss that gave underfoot, as if agreeing temporarily to support weight. The mist behind him stayed respectfully at the edge of the hollow, and the light filtering through the canopy had that dusty, slanting quality usually reserved for childhood memories and late afternoon tea. As Aldrich walked deeper, the trees began to shift subtly, not in shape, but in character. Their bark darkened, not ominously, just deeply, as though storing stories within their trunks. He brushed his fingers along one and felt a faint vibration, like the last line of a poem being recited too quietly to disturb the silence. Soon he came upon a clearing, circular and perfectly imperfect, where the trees leaned outward again, forming a kind of open dome. In the center stood a pedestal, not tall or grand, but modest and round, made from stone too smooth to be accidental. Upon it sat a single inkpot and a quill resting across the rim like it had only just been set down. There was no parchment, but nearby on a low bench carved directly from the roots of a tree sat a figure dressed in faded blue robes, the fabric marked with faint script in a language Aldrich didn't recognize. The figure looked up and nodded, not in greeting but in shared recognition that sometimes it's easier to start with a nod. "You've brought something unfinished," the figure said, not as a question. Aldrich hesitated, then touched the flap of his satchel where the folded questions rested, the almost map, the pine cone, the wooden goat, the leaf that pointed nowhere, and the notebook of openings. The figure stood and gestured to the pedestal. This is where thoughts come to be rewritten, not revised, not corrected, just allowed another shape. Eldrick stepped forward slowly. The ink in the pot shimmered, not with color, but with potential. Something about it seemed to hold both the beginning and the end of everything he hadn't said aloud. The quill looked ordinary, but felt impossibly light when he lifted it, like it had only ever known paper and breath. "You can write here," the figure said gently. "But what you write must be true enough to be boring. Not clever. Not perfect. Just true in the way rain is true even when it doesn't fall." Eldrick blinked, then smiled. "That doesn't narrow things down." "It's not meant to," the figure replied, and sat once more, eyes turned toward the treetops as though waiting for them to finish a sentence. Eldrick dipped the quill in the ink and paused. He thought of writing something grand, but the ink seemed to resist any flourish. Instead he wrote, "I once made tea for someone I missed, and when they didn't come, I drank it anyway." He added another, "Sometimes I forget how to be kind to myself, especially when I'm trying too hard to be kind to others." Again, the ink settled into a sheen that caught the light just enough to be noticed. He wrote 3 more lines, each one quieter than the last, until the pedestal seemed full not of sentences, but of the space around them. When he finished, he placed the quill down and stepped back. The figure stood again and nodded. "You've left something honest," they said. "That's all this place remembers." As Eldrick turned to leave, the trees made no sound, but the path ahead had changed. It now curved slightly to the left, leading toward a part of the forest where the light flickered faintly with movement. He followed it without question, the satchel at his side a little heavier with nothing in particular. Behind him, the ink on the pedestal shimmered once more, then slowly faded into the stone, leaving only a trace of warmth, like breath after a quiet truth. The path ahead curved gently, never quite committing to a direction, but still managing to feel certain in its meandering. Eldrick walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had ceased to care about destination and had instead committed to being entirely present in whatever happened next. The trees here grew thinner, more spaced out, as if respecting the privacy of those who passed between them. The light, however, was not respectful at all. It flickered, not from wind or shadow, but in a way that suggested it was deciding in real time whether to continue existing. It danced across the ground like candlelight, without a source, bending around roots and stones and the occasional stubborn blade of grass that insisted on growing sideways. Eldrick held his satchel a little closer, not out of fear, but comfort. The objects inside had become familiar companions, quiet ones who asked for nothing but wait. The pine cone shifted gently against the notebook of beginnings, and the goat knocked once against the jar that now held silence like a carefully wrapped gift. Up ahead he saw a low structure nestled against a slope, neither a hut nor a house, but something in between. Its roof sagged in a way that made it look thoughtful, and the windows, though shuttered, seemed to blink with the rhythm of the flickering light. He approached cautiously, not out of suspicion, but because everything about this place made rushing feel rude. A small plaque near the door read in faint letters, "If you have forgotten something, please come in quietly." Eldrick, who had by now forgotten at least 6 specific details about his own boots, took this as a perfectly reasonable instruction. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a single lantern hanging from the ceiling that pulsed softly as if inhaling and exhaling light. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled not with books or jars, but with empty lanterns. Hundreds of them, in every shape and size, some squat and square, others tall and narrow, some shaped like teapots, birdhouses, or abstract promises. None of them glowed. A small bell chimed faintly from somewhere deeper in the room, and from a doorway behind a curtain of heavy string beads emerged a tall woman in a dark coat buttoned entirely up the side, her hair bound in loops like punctuation marks. She regarded Eldrick for a moment before speaking. "Have you come to borrow, return, or confess?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "That's usually the best place to start," she said. She walked to one of the shelves and removed a small, flat lantern shaped like a pressed leaf. This one remembers warmth, but not why. Would you like to hold it? Aldrich took the lantern gently. It felt like holding the idea of a campfire, one that had long since gone out but left behind the shape of laughter. "What are they for?" he asked. "Each one once held a light that someone forgot," she replied. "A comfort they didn't notice, a hope they misplaced, a truth they weren't ready to carry. They come here eventually flickering until they decide to rest." "And the one above?" he asked, nodding toward the softly glowing lantern overhead. "That one's trying to remember. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Either way, it forgives itself." She led him to a low table with 2 stools, motioning for him to sit. From beneath the table, she retrieved a small tray of tools, tiny brushes, narrow chisels, a quill with no ink. "If you like," she said, "you can record something you once believed but no longer know if it's true. The lantern will remember it for you. It won't hold it against you." The tools felt familiar in his hands, though he wasn't sure when he'd last used anything smaller than a spoon. On a thin strip of parchment, he wrote, "I once believed that if I tried hard enough, I could make others happy." He paused, then added, "I still try, but I no longer believe it's the same as understanding them." He rolled the parchment and handed it to the woman, who placed it into one of the lanterns with a soft click. The lantern glowed faintly, then dimmed, as if satisfied to know something had been said. As he prepared to leave, she handed him a lantern, simple, round, the kind that might hang in a child's room during winter. "This one isn't empty," she said. "It's resting. Carry it until it decides to wake again." Aldrich took it with both hands. It felt light but stubborn, like a memory that refused to settle. He placed it carefully in the satchel where it nestled beside the others without complaint. As he stepped back out into the flickering light of the forest, he noticed something had changed. Not the path, not the trees, but the way he walked. Less with questions, more with listening. And ahead, the flicker steadied just slightly, as if guiding him not to an answer, but to the next unspoken thought. As Aldrich stepped away from the lantern house, the forest greeted him not with rustling leaves or bird calls, but with a kind of quiet shaped like expectation, the hush that comes when the air itself leans forward slightly. The flickering light had evened out into a soft amber glow that seemed to walk just ahead of him, gently illuminating the curve of the trail without fully committing to brightness. He followed it without question. The satchel against his hip had grown heavier in a way that was no longer about weight. Each item inside, once strange, had grown familiar enough to carry their own presence, like quiet passengers with different dreams. The resting lantern was warm again, faintly so, but with the steady temperature of a hand that doesn't want to let go. Aldrich adjusted the strap of the satchel, letting it settle more snugly across his shoulder, and the trail beneath his boots began to change. It narrowed first, then softened, the moss giving way to a kind of tightly packed earth that yielded gently underfoot like pressed memory. Each step he took left a faint impression, not deep enough to mark, but enough to remind the ground he had passed. He noticed it without concern. This was not a place for erasing footsteps, but for honoring the shape of a walk. Up ahead, the trees began to part once more, and he came into a clearing bordered by wild hedges and ringed with small rounded stones that seemed to have been placed by hand but long ago. In the center stood a low building, barely a story tall, with thick walls of pale stone and a roof made of green tiles that glistened as if they had recently heard something beautiful. There were no doors, only a single window framed by ivy and a wooden sign leaning against the wall that read simply, "Speak only if you must. Listen always." Aldrich tripped the window, but it was shut, not locked, just closed with the quiet finality of something that wasn't ready. He sat on a flat stone nearby and waited, because that seemed to be the agreement here. The light filtered down through the canopy, casting a patterned glow across the clearing like the idea of sunlight remembered by shadow. As he sat, he began to notice details that hadn't presented themselves at first glance. There were chimes strung between some of the trees, but not ones that rang with metal. They were made of thin wood and small bones, twigs and shells, all tied with thread and worn by time. They didn't ring so much as murmur when the breeze passed through, soft clicking and dry whispers that sounded like sentences trying to decide how to begin. From within the building came no sound at all, but the air around it vibrated faintly, as if it contained all the noise not currently being made. Aldrich reached into his satchel and withdrew the nearly forgotten scroll, the one about places almost visited. He unrolled it gently across his lap. A new entry had appeared just below the last, "The Window That Waits to Hear." There was no date, no note, just the title, and that felt right. He didn't speak. Instead, he listened to the wind-tracing loops around the chimes, to the tiny creaks of old stone settling, to the beat of his own heart in his chest, steady and questioning. And then, like a sigh remembered after a long conversation, the window creaked open. Not wide, not beckoning, just enough to reveal a narrow sliver of a room beyond. Inside, Aldrich could make out a low shelf lined with objects, none of which made sense on their own, a spool with no thread, a spoon carved from bark, a pair of spectacles with only one lens. A soft voice, neither young nor old, neither male nor female, emerged from within. "If you could hear one thing you forgot to listen for, what would it be?" Aldrich opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. The voice did not press. It simply waited. He reached again into his satchel and pulled out the small notebook he'd found in the dream hollow, the one filled with half-written beginnings. He opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, "I'm still listening." He tore the page carefully and folded it twice, then set it gently on the windowsill. The paper fluttered once, lifted by a breeze that didn't disturb anything else, and vanished inside. The window remained open, not wider, not closed, just aware. A few moments passed, or maybe many, before the voice spoke again. Sometimes the best way to remember is to forget something else. Choose carefully. Aldrich didn't respond. He simply nodded, more to himself than to the window, and stood. The forest had grown even quieter now, not from silence, but from listening back. And the path ahead curved once more toward a grove of darker trees that held the evening like a promise. As Aldrich stepped away from the open window, the weight of the quiet felt different than before, not heavier, but deeper, like a well that didn't expect water but remembered its shape. The forest path curved toward the grove slowly, like it wasn't sure Aldrich was ready, but he followed, boots crunching faintly on twigs that sounded more like punctuation than protest. The trees here were taller, broader, and darker than the others, though not in any alarming way. They wore their shadows comfortably, like old coats that had learned not to catch on passing thoughts. The grove didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, and Aldrich found himself within it without quite knowing when he'd crossed the threshold. The light had shifted again, not dim, not bright, but the peculiar gray of late dusk on days that forgot to end properly. It settled gently on every surface, from branch to moss, like a pause between sentences too polite to be completed. In the center of the grove stood a small building shaped like a thought that had taken form. Round, smooth, with no visible seams, its walls pale like stone that had been dreaming of clay. No door was visible, just a narrow archway with a curtain made not of fabric but of thin strips of paper, each one printed with single words in a dozen different hands. Aldrich reached out and brushed a few of the papers aside. They rustled faintly, murmuring as they moved, "Still, never, wait, again." He stepped through. The room inside was round, dimly lit by what seemed to be nothing, no candle, no lantern, no window. Yet the room was visible, the way a room might be in memory, softly with corners rounded by familiarity. A chair sat to one side, plain and low, with a cushion that had once been crimson but had since resigned itself to a more meditative hue. Across from it was a low table, and upon it sat a single object, a small, dark box carved with delicate swirls, each one incomplete, as if the carver had paused often to reconsider. The air smelled faintly of dust and time, with the undernote of something like old ink or maybe just old decisions. Aldrich sat not because he was told to, but because the chair seemed to expect it. The box on the table remained still. Nothing moved. Nothing asked. So Aldrich opened the satchel once more and withdrew the resting lantern. He set it on the table. It didn't glow, but it leaned slightly toward the box, and that seemed to matter. He then placed the pine cone beside it, then the scroll of places almost visited, then the folded page he had torn from the notebook. Lastly, he drew out the leaf, the one meant for when directions forget themselves, and placed it carefully in the center of the arrangement. It curled slightly at the edges, still green, still inexplicably alive. The box remained still. The light did not shift, but the room felt fuller now, not with presence, but with permission. Then a whisper, not a sound exactly, but the suggestion of one, stirred from the box. It opened slowly, not on hinges, but with the grace of something that had waited too long to stretch. Inside was not an object, not a message, but a moment. Aldrich saw it clearly, not with his eyes, but with that part of the self that recognizes truth before it has words. It was the exact moment he had once chosen to stay silent when he should have spoken, not out of fear but out of weariness. The moment hovered, not accusing, not forgiving, just existing. And then it folded itself into the shape of a small stone and settled at the bottom of the box. The room did not change, but Aldrich did. Something inside him exhaled, not with relief, but with acknowledgement. He closed the box gently, and as he did, the paper curtain at the entrance rustled again, this time with different words. Now, if Carrie listened. He gathered his belongings slowly. The lantern still slept. The leaf had uncurled slightly, and outside the grove held the evening a little tighter, as if preparing to hand it off to something else entirely. As Aldrich stepped out of the round room into the grove once more, the light had softened into that particular hue that hovers between lavender and ash, the sky above holding the last crumbs of daylight the way one holds the corner of a thought they're not ready to release. The trees stood as they had, tall and dignified, but now they seemed to lean just slightly toward him, not with demand, but with the recognition one gives a traveler who has begun to carry something properly. He walked slowly, following a path that hadn't been visible before but now unfolded ahead like ribbon from a careful hand. The satchel hung a bit differently across his shoulder, not lighter or heavier, but attuned, as if the objects within had arranged themselves into understanding. The pine cone no longer shifted. The lantern, still dormant, felt warmer. The small stone from the box, which Aldrich had pocketed without ceremony, pressed gently against his hip like a reminder he didn't need to remember on purpose. The path left the grove behind without fanfare, bending through narrow hedges and along the edge of a stream that had more curves than direction. The water burbled softly, not asking to be noticed, but too companionable to ignore. Aldrich paused once to crouch beside it and dip his fingers in. The water was cool, carrying with it the faint taste of old stone and distant rain. He didn't drink. He didn't need to. Just touching it felt like agreement. Further on, the path rose again, not steeply, but with the steady purpose of a thought that had taken form and now needed a sentence. As he climbed, the forest began to thin, and the light shifted again, not darker, not brighter, but cleaner somehow, as if the day had been washed and laid out to dry. He emerged onto a flat stretch of land dotted with low stones and tall grass waving gently in the still air. There, just ahead, stood an archway. It wasn't part of a wall, nor did it frame a building. It stood alone, made of pale wood and woven vines, forming a simple curve like a question mark softened by time. Beyond the arch was only more path, continuing downhill toward what looked like open fields and, far off, the first dim glow of a village. It could have been gray weather, or someplace like it, or someplace else entirely. He didn't step through yet. Instead, he sat on the bench, the satchel still resting against his side, and let the wind comb through his thoughts the way it moved the grass, gently, without opinion. He thought of the cartographer and the unfinished places. He thought of the woman with jars full of forgotten sounds, the man who measured fog without needing it to behave, the figure in the grove who spoke in moments, and the countless things he hadn't written down but which now traveled with him in the silence between his footsteps. The lantern beside him stirred faintly, just once, like the hush before a word is chosen. He reached into the satchel and removed it, setting it on the bench. It glowed, not bright, not bold, but enough to cast a small circle of softness on the grass. The light pulsed once, then steadied, and within it Aldrich could see nothing, and yet everything he needed to feel came through, the sense of something finally letting go, not because it had to, but because it had been held long enough. He didn't need to speak. There was nothing more to answer, nothing more to ask. He stood and approached the arch, placing a hand on the wood. It was warm, not with sunlight, but with use, like a handrail touched by many on their way to remembering. He took one breath, not deep, not symbolic, just natural, and stepped forward, not through, not quite, but close enough that the air changed and the earth ahead looked like it might begin again differently. Behind him, the lantern dimmed once more, not fading, just pausing. The grass bent forward slightly in welcome or farewell, and the sky above held its hush. And then the wind shifted again, carrying something faint on its back, the scent of bread, warm and plain, and the kind of quiet that happens just before someone says your name. Aldrich stepped beneath the arch, not as someone crossing into something new, but as someone acknowledging that he had already begun long ago without realizing it. The ground beneath his boots changed, not in substance, but in tone. It felt more familiar now, like a thought that had finally found its place in a sentence. The fields beyond spread out in easy swells, dotted with low clusters of trees and fences, so old they leaned like elders in casual conversation. The village in the distance, still too far to be certain, held a glow that pulsed gently against the horizon, not from lamps or lanterns, but from the accumulated comfort of evenings ending quietly. Aldrich walked without urgency. The wind moved beside him, no longer guiding or testing, but simply accompanying. Birds called overhead, short, declarative chirps that sounded like affirmations or reminders that some things didn't need metaphors. He touched the satchel briefly, where the lantern now rested without movement. It had offered its light and asked for nothing in return. That, he decided, might be enough to call a gift. The landscape here did not ask to be noticed, but it rewarded attention. Each rock seemed placed with the quiet confidence of knowing it didn't need a reason. A distant tree bent at an angle that only made sense if one considered the decades it had leaned into the same breeze. A scarecrow in a fallow field wore a faded blue scarf and held a stick that pointed not at the sky, but at a small pile of stones arranged like a question no one had asked out loud. Aldrich passed it all, taking nothing, leaving only the sound of his footsteps. As the path drew closer to the edge of the village, if that's what it was, and he was starting to believe names were less relevant than impressions, he noticed a building just off the road, low-roofed and wide, with a sign above the door that had long since lost its letters. He paused, then pushed the door open. It creaked softly, not from resistance, but habit. Inside, the room was warm in a way that wasn't about temperature. A stove hummed gently in the corner, though it held no fire. Shelves lined the walls, filled with items that didn't match but didn't clash. A shoe without a mate, a ladle carved from driftwood, a clock with no hands, a collection of buttons sorted by sound instead of size. At a table near the window, a woman sat knitting something that didn't seem to require yarn. She looked up as Aldrich entered and smiled as though she had been expecting exactly someone, and he would do just fine. "Did you bring your weather with you?" she asked, eyes twinkling in a way that made the question more invitation than inquiry. "Only the leftover parts," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense, and continued knitting. For a time, neither spoke. The room held the kind of silence that stretched without strain, like fabric that remembered how to drape. Aldrich looked around and saw a small sideboard with a tray of cups, non-identical, but all clearly belonging to the same kind of moment. He poured himself water from a clay jug that smelled faintly of rosemary and sat back, letting the stillness steep. The woman finished a row and set her work aside. "You're wondering what this place is," she said, not as a statement, but as a placeholder for a question he hadn't formed. "I think I've stopped trying to name things," Aldrich replied. "It's easier to just notice them." She smiled again, softer this time. "That's when they start noticing you back." Outside, the light shifted again, the way it always did at this hour, not quite dusk, not quite night, just the edge of in-between. Aldrich stood and walked to the window. Through the glass he saw the road winding back toward the hills, where the arch still stood quiet and alone. And just past that, if he looked carefully, he could see the trees from the grove, their dark forms unmoved, their shadows long and content. He turned back to the room and opened his satchel one final time. He removed the pine cone and placed it on a shelf beside a small mirror that reflected nothing but the wall. He took out the leaf, still green, and tucked it into a book whose pages had been left blank on purpose. The folded scroll of almost places he unrolled and pinned gently to the back of the door, where it might catch the wind and whisper to those unsure if they've already been. The lantern he kept, but only because it didn't ask to be left. He thought for a moment about the stone in his pocket, then slipped it into the stove, where it settled with a faint sigh. The woman poured herself a cup of nothing and raised it toward him. "To the roads we forget to miss," she said. Aldrich lifted his hand in reply. Outside, a dog barked once, the kind of bark that suggested someone had returned or someone was about to. The village lights now glowed more distinctly, each one flickering like the sound of someone humming a tune they didn't know they remembered, and as Aldrich stepped back through the door and onto the path again, the wind rose once more, not to push, not to pull, but to follow him home in case he forgot the way.